especially welcome to Professor Adam Hanieh, who joins us virtually, I don't know, from London or from Exeter. It's great to have you with us. We will have this afternoon a short introductory lecture by Adam Hanieh, who is a Palestinian writer, author, scientist and activist. I think that most of you will know him and some of his works. If somebody could pass this, I've printed out some of his later articles that have been published in German. We have to do this particular session in English, as it was not possible to provide for simultaneous translation. So I hope with a little bit of mutual aid you will be able to cope. And thank you for being with us, Adam, and the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas and comrades. It's a great pleasure to be part of your conference today, Ökosocialism Conference. What I wanted to do is speak for about 45 minutes or so, looking at some of the bigger questions around imperialism, the current situation in global capitalism, of course related heavily to the new Trump administration, as well as, of course, the wars currently unfolding in the Middle East. Obviously, we're at a moment of severe crisis, the ongoing genocide in Palestine, but also the war launched recently on Iran, ongoing war, and the possibility that the United States might decide to engage directly in this attack on Iran. But I wanted to begin with some comments on the situation facing the Palestinian people and the situation in Gaza, and try to link these questions to the broader struggles of eco-socialism and the question of the climate, because I think these connections are often not well understood in how the questions of the Palestinian struggle, the Middle East, is thought of in relation to eco-socialism. Obviously, over the last 18 months, the genocide in Gaza has become a lightning rod or leading edge of a deep-seated global political radicalization. And I mean this on both the left and the right. We have seen, of course, the total destruction of the infrastructure in Gaza, of a trapped population, daily bombardment by one of the most powerful militaries in the world, leading to probably more than 100,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza, as well as the complete destruction of infrastructure in the Strip. Universities, schools, electricity, sanitation are completely destroyed. We've seen this destruction broadcast 24/7 over the last 2 years, and I'm sure everyone here is following the events closely. But I think it's important to remember that we are seeing the sanitized version of this genocide, and the reality is actually much worse. And the barbarity of this has rightly moved so many into political action. Here in the UK, for example, we've had some of the biggest political mobilizations, demonstrations in the country's history, regularly occurring on the streets of London and elsewhere in the country. We've seen the encampments, the protest movements in the United States and elsewhere. We've seen worker actions, blockading of ports, blockading of different transport infrastructures, trying to prevent the movement of fuel and weapons into the Israeli military. This mobilization, I think, is rightly seen as being perhaps one of the deep-seated, deepest political radicalization since the 1960s. It's really disrupted politics everywhere. Of course, at the same time, and this is what I mean by saying this is a political radicalization on both the left and the right, on the right of the political spectrum, most recently we can see this in the US with Trump, Palestine has also become a leading edge of the right-wing authoritarian turn we've seen globally over the last year or so. So I think it's really important to recognize first that Palestine really does sit at the heart of these two radicalizations on the left and the right. But I wanted to say and basically spend some time discussing the ways in which Palestine is typically framed and thought about and in everyday consciousness, because I think there is a problem with the way Palestine is thought about, not just in the media, not just in everyday discussions, but also on the left. And I mean this in the sense that I think the question of Palestine is often exceptionalized. It's viewed simply through the lens of what is happening in Gaza or in the West Bank, or amidst the political spectrum in Israel, the Netanyahu and other political leaders in Israel. And I think this framing that focuses simply on what is going on in these territories often reduces solidarity to the question of Israel's massive human rights abuses and ongoing violations of international law. And the problem with this human rights framing is that it depoliticizes the Palestinian struggle. It fails to explain why Western states continue to support Israel so unequivocally. And when this question of Western support is raised, many point to a pro-Israel lobby, a supposed pro-Israel lobby that operates in North America and Western Europe as the cause of Western support for the Israeli state. And I think this lobby argument is actually politically dangerous, it's false, and it gets the relationship between Western states and Israel fundamentally wrong. We need to break with these kinds of framings and instead place Palestine in the global context in which Israeli settler colonialism operates, and the particular conjuncture of global capitalism that we are currently living. So what do I mean by this? The first thing I would say is that we need to situate Western support for Israel and the actions of Israeli settler colonialism against Palestinians for now more than 80 years in the crucial place of the Middle East, the wider regional Middle East, in how our oil-centered world emerged from the mid-20th century onwards. I think it's very striking that so much discussion of Palestine ignores this regional question. It abstracts from the centrality of the Middle East to our oil-centered world. Around the time of the Second World War, the Middle East became a key crucible of global politics. And it became so because of two major transitions. Firstly, the shift to oil as the leading fossil fuel, adding, of course, to coal as the underpinning of transport infrastructure, of new materials such as petrochemicals, and really expanding through the middle of the 20th century what scientists call the Great Acceleration, the impact of which we are living in the consequences of the climate emergency today. So this transition to oil as the leading fossil fuel that took place around 1950, first in the United States, then in Western Europe, and then more globally, was deeply connected to the Middle East because of its major oil supplies. The Middle East was key to this coal to oil transition that took place in the middle of the 20th century because it was the major site of the world's oil supplies outside of the US and Soviet Union at the time. So that was the first transition, and I'll come back to this in a second. The second transition, global transition that took place in the middle of the 20th century, of course, was the emergence of the United States as the dominant capitalist power, displacing older European colonial powers, in particular Britain and France. So we had this, this shift away from post-World War II, Britain and France as dominant colonial and global powers towards the United States as the global hegemon, and very closely connected to this, the emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel. And as I said, the Middle East was key to both of these transitions because it was the major site of the world's oil supplies. And in this position, it underpinned the American-led oil to coal transition in Western Europe and later the rest of the world. Most important here were the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, which I'll have a bit to speak about a little bit later, but in particular, I'm speaking here about Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the smaller Gulf monarchies on the Arabian Peninsula, like the United Arab Emirates. It was as the US replaced European colonial rule in the Middle East, it built alliances with the United States, with these monarchies, guaranteeing their survival at a time of massive anti-colonial rebellions across the region. Of course, at this moment, I'm talking 1950s, 1960s, the main kind of anti-colonial struggle was really led by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, which reverberated across the whole region and really threatened, if you like, the old European colonial order. And through the 1950s and 1960s, the United States entered the Middle East, basically taking over the European colonial structures and building alliances with various regimes in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran at the moment in the 60s being key to American power in the region at that time. Now, the other second pillar to American power in the Middle East was, of course, Israel, particularly after the 1967 war, in which Israel destroyed the armed force and political legitimacy of Egypt, Egypt being that the center of Nasserism and the anti-colonial rebellions. From 1967 onwards, obviously before 1967, the main kind of backer of Israeli settler colonialism was Britain, which kind of shepherded Israel into being through 1947, 1948. But after 1967, with the drawdown of British colonial rule, Israel became the core American ally in the region, backed by billions in military and financial subsidies from the American state. Not just military and financial support, of course. The other key aspect to American support of Israel is, of course, its political, unequivocal political backing of the Israeli state. And we can see that, of course, very clearly today. Now, it's worth asking, I think, why Israel came to play this particular role within American power in the Middle East region. And I think a key aspect to this is understanding Israel's nature as a settler colonial state, a state that is founded on the ongoing dispersion of the Palestinian population since 1948. Settler colonies, and of course we can point to many settler colonies globally. South African apartheid is another clear example. These kinds of societies must continually work to fortify structures of racial oppression, class exploitation and dispossession. And as a consequence, they are typically highly militarized and violent societies, which tend to be reliant upon external support to maintain their material privileges in a hostile regional context. And when a substantial proportion of settler colony societies benefit from the oppression of indigenous populations and come to understand their privileges in racialized and militaristic terms, settler colonies act as much more dependable partners of Western imperial interests than normal client states. So we can see this very clearly in the context of the Middle East, where the Israeli state has really been the key anchor of American power in the region since that 1967 moment. It's not to say, of course, the US doesn't support Jordan, doesn't support Egypt and these other kinds of client states, but it's because of the particular settler colony aspect of Israel that it becomes a much more dependable partner than other Arab client regimes. And in this sense, it's very similar to the role that South African apartheid played within Western colonialism through the African continent up until the formal end of apartheid. So this relationship is explicitly why British colonialism supported Zionism as a political movement in the early 20th century, and why the US embraced Israel in the post-1967 moment. So I've been speaking here about some of this earlier history, the 60s and 70s, but it remains true today in critical ways, and want to come into this kind of regional, the more contemporary moment at this moment, because the two main pillars of American influence throughout the 20th century and up until the current moment remain, on one side, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies, and on the other, the Israeli state. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the Gulf, because again, I think it's impossible to understand what is going on today in the Middle East, to understand what's going on in Gaza, to understand what's going on in Iran, without actually a deeper understanding of the nature of the Gulf monarchies, in particular Saudi Arabia, but I'm also talking here about the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, the six Gulf monarchies that are collected together in what is called the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, I had said that these states were essential to the coal to oil transition, the rise of oil as the leading fossil fuel in the middle of the 20th century. And today, these states remain the largest exporters of oil and gas in the world. Basically, about a third of the world's oil trade, oil imports come from these Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia. These states are all monarchies. They are headed by hereditary monarchs. But what is really critical to understand about these states is they are also, their social and class structures are based upon a non-citizen migrant work population. In all of the Gulf states, more than half of the labor force are made up of non-citizen migrant workers who have no route to any kind of permanent residency or permanent living situation in these states. There is no other place on the planet where there is such a high proportion of temporary, precarious migrant work that really underpins the class structures of these states. And of course, in some of these states, like the UAE, like Qatar, like Kuwait, we're talking only 10% of the population of these states that actually hold citizenship. The vast majority of the population are non-citizen migrant workers. Why is this important? It distinguishes the Gulf states and distinguishes capitalism in the Gulf from other major oil and gas exporters in the region. I'm thinking in particular of Iraq and Iran. In both Iraq and Iran, also major reserves of hydrocarbons. However, in both those countries, which used to be ruled by monarchs and used to be very important to the United States and European colonialism in the early part of the 20th century, but in both those states, we see the emergence of very militant labor movements, militant left parties of different denominations through the 20th century, revolutions and the overthrow of those monarchies. That did not happen in the Gulf, and one of the key reasons it didn't happen was because of this particular class structure that exists in these Gulf states, in which the working class is this precarious non-citizen population who can simply be deported at any time of economic crisis or political crisis. And this is clearly what has happened in the last, at various moments in the last few decades. So what I'm saying is, I'm emphasizing this point because I think very often people think of the Gulf as simply oil spigots. They don't think about the class structure of these particular societies. Now, I had said that the Gulf states were really crucial to the emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel. And throughout most of the 20th century, that was through the export of oil and gas to Western Europe and also to the United States. Now, it is really crucial to understand that today, that oil trade has completely shifted. It is no longer the case that the Gulf's oil flows westward. Today, the vast majority, more than 70% of the oil and gas exports from the Gulf flows eastward to China and East Asia. And in this sense, this is a shift that's happened since the early 2000s. About half of China's oil today comes from the Gulf. And in this sense, the Gulf underpinned the emergence of China as a major or a new center of global capital accumulation. The emergence of China as a major industrial and manufacturing hub depended fundamentally on the Gulf's oil and gas reserves shifting eastward to China. So it's really important to understand this change in the oil export of the Gulf, and I want to come back to this point a little bit later. The other aspect of the Gulf states that's really important to emphasize is that unlike the early 20th century, middle 20th century that I had spoken about earlier, in which case, during which the Gulf's oil industry was controlled by Western oil companies, today that is not the case. Today we have large nationalized or national oil companies owned by the Gulf states that are in control of the production and refining and export of the oil reserves in these states. In particular, I'm thinking here about the biggest oil company in the world, Saudi Aramco. Again, I really want to emphasize this point because I think among eco-socialists, among all of us concerned with the climate emergency, we forget sometimes the critical role of these national oil companies, like Saudi Aramco, in the current fossil fuel or fossil capitalism. Saudi Aramco used to be an American oil company, but today it is owned by the Saudi state, controlled by the Saudi state. It is by far the largest national oil company, by far the largest oil company in the world. In fact, last year, its profits, Aramco's profits, exceeded the combined profits of BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Total Energies. So we're talking about a huge oil company which dwarfs these Western super majors in terms of its oil exports, in terms of its control over infrastructure, and really critically, in terms of its downstream activities. Aramco and other national oil companies in the Gulf, like the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is another major one, are not simply extractors of crude upstream oil. They have diversified down the oil value chain to control refineries, to control transport infrastructures, to control tankers, and also petrochemicals and the plastics industry. So we need to understand these oil companies as large, diversified downstream conglomerates, not simply as crude oil exporters. Now, why am I emphasizing the importance of these national oil companies, because in the context of the climate emergency, it's very clear that these companies are playing a leading role in blocking any kind of climate negotiations. We can see this in the COP summits, the COP28 summit, of course, which was convened in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. It was headed, this COP summit was headed, of course, by the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Sultan Al-Jaber, and in which position he, Al-Jaber, as well as Aramco and other national oil companies, basically blocked any kind of a reference to fossil fuels and to oil and needing to pull back on oil. So I think it's very clear that a leading part of obstructing global climate action is now being played by these national oil companies who really take a leading seat in these kinds of discussions. So, sorry. I've spoken about the Gulf states, the oil and gas reserves, its exports, the eastward shift to China, the importance of the national oil companies. But there's another aspect to the Gulf that I think is often not well understood, and that is the enormous wealth that has accumulated in these states through their hydrocarbon exports. This is, of course, something that began to become evident in the middle of the 20th century. But today it is really important to understand that the trillions of dollars financial surpluses that are accumulating in the Gulf states have really been a central part of how the global financial system developed through the 20th century. Because what happened through the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s is that this oil wealth was largely invested in US financial markets, in US Treasury bonds, US stock markets, and also through the consumption of military hardware that were the purchase of military hardware from American military companies. So in this sense, much of the wealth that was obtained in the Gulf from the export of oil was recirculated into the American financial system and played a very important role in centering the US dollar as the main international reserve currency, or as we would say, as Marxists, world money. The US dollar's position as world money was deeply connected to the emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel because of these petrodollar recirculation through investments in US financial markets, the pricing of oil in dollars, as well as the consumption of military arms. Now today, this pattern continues to be really important to the American financial system. And in fact, perhaps even more important today than it was through the 70s and 80s. If we look, for example, at the Gulf financial investments in US stock markets, we see that the Gulf is actually the largest foreign investor in US equities outside of the financial zones like London, the Cayman Islands, and so forth, where a lot of investments channeled into the US. But if we compare the Gulf's investments in US equities to those of Germany, of France, of other major powers, it's far in excess. And that is increasing. So one of the consequences of the boom in oil consumption globally, this shift of oil exports to China, has been the accumulation of trillions of dollars of financial surpluses in the Gulf, and much of this has found its way, continues to find its way into US financial markets. Also, the question of arms consumption, military consumption remains really important. The Gulf is the largest importer of military hardware in the world. And most of this comes from the United States, from US arms companies. So I'm trying to paint a picture here that's more complex than simply the export of oil and gas, and think about the ways in which financial surpluses through these these exports are integrated, still remain integrated within US financial markets. Because I think what this does, it helps to make sense of why Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states have played such a leading and visible role in American foreign policy over the last decade or so. It is no accident that the first country that Donald Trump visited after his election in 2016 was Saudi Arabia. And it is no accident that the first country he visited after his recent election was again Saudi Arabia, then the UAE, and then Qatar. And through these visits, we saw many announcements about the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, and Qatar, pledging more than trillions of dollars, 1.4 trillion in the case of the UAE, about $1 trillion in the case of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, investments into the United States, and increased sales of weapons, Boeing in particular, and aircraft to these states. So we see the priority in which the Trump administration, it's not just the Trump administration, it's also the Biden administration, place upon these Gulf monarchies through to today. So let me just try to again zoom out to the regional question again, because I had said at the beginning of this, or the introduction, that basically American power in the Middle East has been founded historically since the 1960s on two major pillars. On one side, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies, and on the other side, Israel. Now, what the United States has attempted to do over the last 2 decades is integrate these two pillars together to normalize the political and the economic relationships between Israel and the Gulf under American hegemony. This is a long-standing strategic imperative of American power since the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, but of course it reached its apex with the 2020 Abraham Accords, which saw the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalize their economic and political connections with Israel. And today, deep investments between, in particular, the UAE and Israel following those accords. Now, those accords signed within the first Trump administration would not have happened without Saudi acquiescence. Nothing happens in the Gulf without Saudi Arabia being aware and supportive of it. So we can see kind of the last kind of jigsaw puzzle part of this attempt to integrate these two pillars of American power is actually Saudi Israel normalization. Why is this so important to the United States? And here I think we can understand really the events of the last 2 years very clearly, what the United States is attempting to do, given its relative decline in power globally, the rise of other rivals such as those in China, Russia, and elsewhere. What the United States is attempting to do is to reassert its primacy in the Middle East through knitting together these two pillars under American influence, under an American umbrella, because it is very clear that in the event of any heightened conflict with China, that the Middle East would play, and particularly the Gulf states, would play a critical role. There is no way that sanctions could be imposed on China without integrating Saudi Arabia and the UAE into this. There's no way of... these states are really central to any kind of, will be central to any kind of heightened conflict in the future with China. And it is clear over the last 2 decades that the Gulf has kind of deepened these East-East connections through these energy exports and other kinds of political agreements. And what the US is trying to do is to bring the Gulf back into its orbit and to get this normalization with Israel occurring. So we see, as part of this reassertion of American primacy, this is why the United States has so unequivocally backed Israel's actions in Gaza. It is why the United States has, under Biden, but also under Trump, there's no difference here. It is not that it is not an Israeli lobby that causes the policy. It is the American state and American capitalism that is really trying to beat back any rivals, any potential centers of power in the Middle East. Today, that of course includes Iran, but it included, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon last year, and the Palestinian people in Gaza and elsewhere. The defeat of these rivals is really central to the American project in the region. That is why Israel is playing this historic role of attack and projection of American power. And just to be very clear on this, some people might say, well, how is the normalization with the Gulf going to be advanced with the destruction that we see in Gaza? It is unfortunately very clear that the Gulf powers, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have no interest in the Palestinian people. They have very much aligned themselves with the United States and with Israeli actions. Of course, they need to play to a domestic audience in the kinds of things they speak about, but we should be under no illusions that these monarchies are in any way stand on the side of the oppressed populations in the region. So I think we can see this very clearly. I mentioned Trump's visit to the Gulf a couple of weeks ago. We can see this clearly with the war against Iran today, in which the United States is considering joining directly. Of course, there's debates within American ruling class and the American state about what's the best way to proceed around this, but I don't think we should be under any illusion, and Israeli officials say this quite openly, that the United States was unaware or did not support Israel's attack against Iran, bombing of Iran when it began. So let me just wrap up, just a couple of concluding remarks. I began by saying, I think it's important to de-exceptionalize Palestine and Gaza today. We often, I think, talk about Palestine and Gaza simply from the perspective of the massive human rights atrocities that we see, but that depoliticizes these struggles. It separates them out from the bigger global context, and in particular, the centrality of the Middle East to how our oil-centered world emerged. We can't understand Palestine without understanding the Gulf, without understanding the place of oil and fossil fuels in global capitalism today. It also is a window, viewing Palestine in this way is a window to understanding struggles in other parts of the region, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iran, as part of this unified whole, not simply as separate struggles, but really integrated with the broader question of revolution and social change in the Middle East. I want to finish just with 2 points. What I've said today, and I think this is something perhaps people might want to discuss, but I really do think we need to see Trump and Trump's political project. I don't want to personalize it around Trump as the individual, but the project that is really centered upon him as the American president. I think we need to understand this as a coherent political project, in the sense that it's not the actions of a madman, it's not the actions of someone who's a Russian agent, as some on the left like to describe him. I'm not saying this is a political project that will succeed, but it is an attempt to deal with this moment of relative decline of the American power globally. It's an attempt to reassert American primacy globally, but in the Middle East, particularly through the continued support of Israel and Saudi Arabia, and of course ratcheting up as part of this violence and war as a key element of American global hegemony. So that's the first question, the first point I would end on. Second point, just to bring it back to the theme of this conference, I really firmly believe that Palestine needs to be seen as a climate issue. It is a climate issue not because of the ecocide and the destruction of the ecosystem in Gaza. It's a climate issue not because of the gas reserves in the Mediterranean. Of course, there are gas reserves in the Mediterranean. Of course, there is ecocide occurring in the Gaza Strip. But Palestine is fundamentally a climate issue because of the place of the Middle East in our fossil fuel order. There is no way of breaking with oil and dealing with the climate emergency without challenging this American global hegemony in the Middle East and the position of the Gulf states. And Palestine is the integral feature of this because of the place of Israeli settler colonialism in American power. So as eco-socialists, we need to foreground Palestine as a climate issue for precisely those reasons. It is not simply a human rights or ecological catastrophe. It's a fundamental struggle in dismantling our fossil fuel-centered world. Thank you.